There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, a simple inconvenience, a misplaced object, a forgotten task. They feel small, mundane, just another ripple in the fabric of a day. It is only later, when you look back from the quiet shoreline of the future, that you see it for what it was. Not a ripple, but the exact point where a deep and powerful current shifted course, altering the entire landscape of your world forever. For me, that moment was the soft, metallic click of a lock that refused to turn on a cold autumn night, with the only person I had ever truly loved standing beside me in the echoing silence of a hallway that had suddenly become the whole universe. We had been walking. It was late, well past midnight, the city air scrubbed clean by an earlier rain and carrying the first real bite of impending winter. Liam had been quiet for most of the evening, a heavy, contemplative stillness that had settled over him while we were sprawled on my couch, pretending to watch a movie that neither of us was following. His head had been resting on my chest, a familiar weight that had, over the past few months, become as essential and unconscious as my own breathing. I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heart against my ribs, a metronome marking the passage of a fragile, beautiful, and terrifying time. He had shifted, sighed, and then whispered into the fabric of my shirt, his voice muffled and thick with something I couldn't name. "Can we just walk for a bit? I feel like the walls are closing in," and so we had. We walked through the sleeping streets, our shoulders occasionally brushing, the sound of our footsteps the only percussion in the vast, quiet symphony of the night. We didn't talk about the walls or why they were closing in. We never did. We simply existed in the space he had created, a space of unspoken need that I had become an expert at navigating, and a space of unspoken love that I had become an expert at hiding. When we returned to my apartment building, the warmth of the lobby was a welcome reprieve. We rode the elevator up in that same comfortable silence, the low hum of the machinery a familiar sound. But at my door, my hand went to my pocket and found nothing. I checked the other, then my back pockets, a small, cold knot of dread beginning to form in my stomach. I could feel Liam's gaze on me, patient, unquestioning. I patted down my jacket again, the crinkle of the fabric loud in the stillness. Nothing. The keys, my entire set, were sitting on the small wooden bowl by the door, inside the apartment. I had taken them out when we first got home from our respective jobs that evening, and in my haste to get out for the walk, a walk designed to soothe the very restlessness that now had us stranded, I had forgotten them completely. "I don't have my keys," I said, the words feeling stupid and small. I turned the knob, a useless, hopeful gesture. It didn't budge. I pressed my forehead against the cool wood of the door, a door that had become such a potent symbol in our unspoken story. The door I always left ajar for him. The door he never had to knock on. The door that represented a threshold he had crossed so many times physically, but never, I feared, emotionally. And now it was a barrier, solid and absolute. Liam didn't laugh or get frustrated. He just shifted his weight, his hands finding his own pockets. "Well," he said, his voice calm, a low rumble that seemed to absorb my own rising panic. "That's a problem." He looked down the hallway, then back at me. The fluorescent lights of the corridor hummed above us, casting our faces in a sterile, unforgiving glow, stripping away all the soft shadows and comfortable ambiguities we had been living in. In that moment, there was nowhere left to hide. We were just two men, locked out, with nothing between us but a few feet of linoleum and years of things I had never had the courage to say. And I knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was liberating, that the current had shifted. To understand the weight of that locked door, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship, the foundation upon which it was built. I met Liam during our first week of university. We were both on the swim team, two bodies among many, cutting through the chlorinated blue of the campus pool. He was all kinetic energy, a whirlwind of broad shoulders, easy laughter, and a smile that seemed to catch and refract the light. He moved through the world with an unthinking grace, a casual confidence that drew people into his orbit like planets around a sun. I, on the other hand, was a creature of the periphery, I was a photographer even then, my eyes always seeking the frame, the composition, the quiet detail that told the larger story. I observed. I watched. And from the very first day, I watched Liam. I remember the first time he spoke to me. We were shivering at the edge of the pool after a grueling practice, the air cold on our wet skin. I was trying to discreetly stretch out a cramp in my calf, my focus entirely internal, when his voice cut through my concentration. "You're Leo, right? You've got a killer backstroke. Seriously, it's like you're frictionless." I looked up, startled. He was grinning, water dripping from the ends of his dark hair, his eyes a startlingly clear shade of green. I mumbled a thank you, my own words feeling clumsy and ill-formed compared to his easy compliment. He just laughed, a sound like stones tumbling in a river, and clapped me on the shoulder. The touch was casual, meaningless to him. But for me, it was an anchor point, the first pin in a map of a territory I would spend the next decade exploring in secret. Our friendship grew organically, effortlessly. We fell into a rhythm dictated by the punishing schedule of student-athletes. Early morning practices, shared meals in the dining hall, where we would consume frightening amounts of food, classes, late-night study sessions in the library, and weekend meets that blurred into a montage of bus rides and the smell of chlorine. He was the talker, the one who could charm the coaches, debate with professors, and make friends in the checkout line at the grocery store. I was the listener, the steady presence, the one who saw the flicker of exhaustion behind his energetic facade, the one who knew his coffee order by heart, the one who could sit with him in silence for hours without it ever feeling empty. We were a study in contrasts, a perfect pairing of complementary forces. He pulled me out of my shell, and I think, provided him with a quiet harbor, a place where he didn't have to perform. The feelings I developed for him were not a sudden storm, but a slow, creeping tide. It began as admiration, a deep respect for his discipline and his kindness. It evolved into a profound affection, the kind of bond that makes another person's happiness feel intrinsically linked to your own. And then, somewhere in the quiet hours of 1,000 shared moments, it deepened into love. It was a love that settled into my bones, a constant, low-frequency hum beneath the surface of my life. It was in the way I found myself framing photographs in my mind, with him always as the focal point. The way the light caught the curve of his neck as he studied, the way his expression softened when he was truly listening to someone, the concentration in his eyes just before a race. My camera became an extension of my gaze, a way for me to capture and keep the pieces of him he gave away so freely, without him ever knowing the true value I placed on them. I told myself it was enough. The friendship was a beautiful, rare thing, a structure built of trust and shared history. To confess my feelings felt like taking a sledgehammer to that foundation. What would I be risking it for? A moment of awkward rejection? The slow, painful dissolution of the most important relationship in my life? Liam was straight. He dated women, a string of bright, lovely girlfriends who I was always polite to, who I learned to see as temporary fixtures in the architecture of his life. I would watch him with them, the easy way he would sling an arm around their shoulders, the casual intimacy of his touch, and a quiet, hollow ache would open up inside of me. But I would swallow it down, plaster a smile on my face, and be the supportive best friend. It was a role I had perfected, a performance that became second nature. I built walls around my heart, thick and high, and from the safety of my fortress, I loved him quietly, patiently, and completely. After graduation, our lives diverged in practice, but not in spirit. He went into the demanding world of software engineering, his days filled with code and logic and deadlines. I pursued photography, a life of freelance gigs, uncertain paychecks, and the constant search for beauty in the mundane. We ended up in the same city, our apartments a 20-minute drive apart. The rhythm of our friendship changed, but the core remained. We were no longer bound by swim practice and class schedules, but by a chosen, intentional connection. We had weekly dinners, long phone calls about work-related frustrations, and a standing tradition of watching terrible action movies on Friday nights. He was the constant in my life, the northern star I oriented myself by. I was, I believe, the same for him, his best friend, his brother, the keeper of his stories. And I was content with that. Or rather, I had convinced myself I was. Because the alternative was a silence I couldn't bear to imagine. For years, this equilibrium held. It was a delicate balance, a life lived on a knife's edge of hope and resignation. I had my work, my small circle of friends, and my quiet, solitary life. And I had Liam. I had the easy camaraderie, the shared laughter, the deep, abiding comfort of his presence. I learned to live with the low-grade hum of my unspoken love. It was like a chronic condition, something you manage rather than cure. I photographed cityscapes and landscapes, portraits of strangers, the quiet poetry of abandoned buildings. But my true art, the masterpiece I worked on every single day, was the careful concealment of my own heart. I became a master of misdirection, of casual affection that never crossed the line, of listening with an intensity that I prayed he would misinterpret as purely platonic. I lived a double life, not of action, but of emotion. Outwardly, I was Leo, the calm, dependable friend. Inwardly, I was a cartographer, endlessly mapping the contours of a love that had no name and no destination. And then, Sarah left him. She was his girlfriend of 3 years, the one everyone, including me, thought he would marry. From my perspective, she was kind and intelligent, and she seemed to genuinely love him. But there was always a subtle friction I observed between them, a sense of two people speaking slightly different languages. He seemed to dim his own light around her, to fold himself into a shape that was more acceptable, more conventional. But he had been trying, truly trying, to make it work. Her leaving was not a dramatic explosion, but a quiet, sad erosion. He called me the night it happened, his voice uncharacteristically thin over the phone. "She's gone," he said, and the 2 words held a universe of defeat. She packed her things while I was at work. "Just left a note, I'm on my way." I replied, no hesitation. I didn't ask what happened or what he needed. I just knew I had to go. I found him sitting on the floor of his living room, surrounded by the ghosts of a shared life. A space on the bookshelf where her novels used to be. The empty spot on the wall where a piece of art she loved had hung. He was staring at the note in his hand, his shoulders slumped. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, the usual bright energy that surrounded him completely extinguished. I didn't say anything. I just sat down on the floor across from him, my back against the couch, and waited. For nearly an hour, we sat in silence, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes hollow. "She said I was distant," he whispered, the word tasting like a foreign object in his mouth. Like a part of me was always somewhere else. That I was living behind a glass wall. "Do you think that's true, Leo? Am I behind a wall?" The irony was a physical blow. Here he was, asking me, the architect of my own emotional fortress, about walls. I wanted to tell him that we all have walls. I wanted to tell him that his were made of glass, transparent and confusing, while mine were made of stone, solid and deliberate. But I couldn't. I was his best friend. My role was to comfort, not to confess. "I think you've been under a lot of stress," I said, my voice gentle. "Work has been brutal, and relationships are hard. It's not on you. It's just something that happened." It was a weak, flimsy answer, a bandage on a gaping wound, but it was all I could offer without betraying myself. He stayed at my apartment that night. He couldn't bear the emptiness of his own. I gave him the bedroom, and I took the couch. I lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sound of his breathing from the other room. It was the first crack in our carefully maintained structure, the first time the lines of our friendship had been blurred by necessity. It was the beginning of the shift, the first indication that the tide, after years of predictability, was beginning to turn. I didn't know it then, but he was building a new habit, a new pattern of seeking refuge. And my home, my quiet, ordered space, was becoming his sanctuary, my presence, his comfort, and my heart, a place of both solace and profound, unspoken complication. The weeks that followed his breakup with Sarah were a strange, liminal time. Liam navigated his newfound single life with a kind of bewildered numbness. He threw himself into work, spending long hours at the office, and when he wasn't working, he was often at my door. It started with dinners, which was normal for us, but soon the dinners bled into late evenings. We would talk, or not talk, just sharing the space, the silence between us as comfortable as a well-worn blanket. He seemed to need the simple fact of my presence, a steady point in his unmoored world. And I, of course, gave it to him freely. Every knock on my door was a gift, every shared hour a stolen treasure. I was so focused on being the friend he needed that I failed to see the subtle ways he was changing, the ways our dynamic was being rewritten, sentence by sentence, gesture by gesture. The ritual began about a month after the breakup. It was a Friday night, one of our usual movie nights. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action film. Liam, who was usually engaged, shouting at the screen and critiquing the terrible dialogue, was silent. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes bruised with fatigue. Halfway through the movie, he shifted, and without a word, he stretched out, resting his head in my lap. My entire body went rigid. It wasn't a sexual gesture, not in the slightest. It was the unthinking, innocent intimacy of a child seeking comfort. But for me, it was a cataclysm. I could feel the warmth of his scalp through the thin fabric of my jeans, smell the faint scent of his shampoo, something clean, like sandalwood and rain. I forced myself to breathe, to relax my muscles, to make my hand, which was hovering awkwardly in the air, rest on the back of the couch. I stared at the television screen, the explosions and car chases a meaningless blur of color and noise. All of my senses were focused on the man in my lap, on the weight of him, the trust in the gesture, and the terrifying, exhilarating proximity. He fell asleep like that. His breathing deepened, a soft, rhythmic sound that filled the quiet space between the movie's sound effects. I didn't move for over an hour. My leg went numb, a pins and needles sensation spreading from my thigh to my foot, but I didn't care. I just watched the rise and fall of his chest, the way his eyelashes cast small shadows on his cheeks in the flickering light of the screen. In that moment, the years of carefully constructed walls seemed to crumble to dust. It was no longer an abstract love, a feeling I kept locked away in a dark room of my mind. It was here, tangible and real and breathing in my lap. It was a beautiful agony. When the movie ended and the credits rolled, casting the room in a soft, blue glow, I gently shook his shoulder. "Liam," I whispered. "Hey, the movie's over," he stirred, blinking up at me with a disoriented look. "Oh," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Sorry. I guess I was more tired than I thought." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and the loss of his weight, his warmth, was immediate and acute. A cold space where he had been. "You should probably head home, get some real rest," I said, my voice sounding impossibly normal, a betrayal of the storm raging inside me. He looked around my small living room, then at the dark windows. He seemed to hesitate, a flicker of something, vulnerability, loneliness, in his eyes. "Yeah, I should," he said, but he made no move to stand. He just looked at me. Would it be okay if I just crashed here? On the couch. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Of course," I said, again with that infuriating, practiced calm. "You know you're always welcome." That night established the new pattern. It became our ritual. One night a week turned into 2, then 3. He would come over after work, we'd eat, we'd watch something, and at some point, he would gravitate towards me. First, it was just leaning his head on my shoulder. Then, he started draping an arm over my chest. Eventually, he would just curl up against my side, his body fitting against mine as if it were designed to be there, and fall asleep. I became his human pillow, his weighted blanket. And I let him. Every single time, I let him. Each night was a masterclass in self-control. My mind would race, cataloging every detail. The pressure of his head on my collarbone, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch against my stomach in his sleep, the sound of his soft sighs. I was hyper-aware of my own body, careful not to make any sudden movements, not to let my hand stray from a safe, neutral position on his back or shoulder, terrified that a single misinterpreted touch would shatter the fragile truce we were living in. It was a strange kind of intimacy, one that existed entirely in a gray area of plausible deniability. He was my grieving, exhausted best friend seeking comfort. I was the safe harbor he had found. Any other interpretation was a product of my own secret, hopeless love. That was the story I told myself. That was the story that allowed me to survive it. The door to my bedroom was always left open. It was a silent invitation, an unspoken offer of a more comfortable place to sleep. Some nights, after he'd been asleep on the couch for an hour or two, I would manage to disentangle myself and retreat to my own bed. I would lie there, staring at the ceiling, my body still humming with the ghost of his presence, and I would listen for any sound of him stirring. I would leave the door open, a wide, dark rectangle in the wall, hoping he might wake up and come in, that he might finally choose the bed over the couch. But he never did. He would just sleep on the couch until morning, waking up stiff and groggy, thanking me with a sheepish smile before heading off to his own apartment to shower and change for work. The open door became a metaphor for my heart. It was accessible, available, waiting for him to walk through it. But he seemed content to remain on the threshold, in the comfortable, less complicated space of the living room. The ritual was a source of both profound comfort and exquisite torture. I was closer to him than I had ever been, sharing a physical intimacy I had never dreamed possible. But it was a conditional intimacy, one predicated on his need and my silence. He was, I believed, the unknowing initiator, seeking solace without understanding the full context of where he was seeking it. And I was the quiet observer, a willing participant in a play where I knew all the lines, but was only allowed to speak the ones written for the part of best friend. This went on for months. The seasons began to turn outside my window, the green leaves of summer surrendering to the fiery colors of autumn. The air grew crisper, the nights longer. And with the changing season, a new level of restlessness seemed to take root in Liam. The deep exhaustion that had defined him post-breakup was being replaced by a kind of agitated energy. He was sleeping less, even when curled up against me on the couch. I would feel him shift, his muscles tense, his breathing shallow. He was still seeking the comfort of my presence, but it seemed to be less effective, the solace it offered becoming more temporary. The night we got locked out was one of those nights. He had arrived at my apartment looking particularly frayed, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed. He barely touched the dinner I made. When we settled on the couch, he was practically vibrating with a pent-up, nervous energy. He couldn't get comfortable. He shifted, sighed, and finally pushed himself up. That's when he'd asked to go for a walk, to escape the closing walls. And in my desire to soothe him, to give him the space and air he needed, I had made the simple, stupid mistake of forgetting my keys. So there we were, standing in the sterile, humming silence of the third-floor hallway. My forehead was still pressed against the door, the cool would a small comfort against my heated skin. The reality of our situation was settling in. It was nearly 1 a.m. My building's superintendent was an elderly man who was notoriously difficult to rouse. Calling a locksmith would take time and cost a fortune. Liam's apartment was a 20-minute drive away, but his keys were in his other jacket, which was, of course, inside my apartment. We were well and truly stranded. "Okay," Liam said, his voice pulling me back from my spiral of panic. He sounded calm, practical. He was always the practical one in a crisis. "Let's think. Is there a spare key anywhere? With a neighbor?" I shook my head, not lifting it from the door. "No. I always meant to give a copy to Mrs. Gable next door, but I never got around to it." He was quiet for a moment. I could feel his presence behind me, a steady warmth in the cool air of the hallway. I imagined he was running through a checklist in his mind, a flowchart of logical solutions. It was how his brain worked, how he solved problems with code. Find the bug, isolate the variable, execute a fix. But this wasn't a bug in a line of code. This was a locked door. And it was my fault. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice muffled by the door. "This is so stupid. I wasn't thinking, hey," he said, and his voice was softer now. "It's not stupid. It's a mistake. It happens." He took a step closer, and I felt his hand on my shoulder, a gentle, reassuring pressure. "We'll figure it out." His touch, as always, was both a comfort and a jolt. I finally lifted my head from the door and turned to face him. The harsh overhead light carved sharp lines on his face, highlighting the exhaustion he had been trying to hide all evening. For the first time, I saw not just restlessness in his eyes, but something else. Fear, or maybe confusion. He looked as lost as I felt. The roles had reversed. He was no longer just the one seeking comfort. He was offering it, even when he seemed to have none to spare. "We can sit on the stairs," he suggested. "Try to call the super in the morning. No sense in just standing here." He was right. We made our way to the emergency stairwell at the end of the hall. The heavy fire door creaked open, revealing a concrete cavern, cold and smelling of dust and paint. We sat down on the top landing, our backs against the cinder block wall. The only light came from the sliver of hallway visible through the crack in the door. It was a bleak, liminal space, a place of transit not meant for lingering. It felt appropriate. We had been lingering in an emotional transit lounge for months, and now, finally, we were physically stuck in one too. We sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. I hugged my knees to my chest, trying to generate some warmth. The thin jacket I'd grabbed was no match for the creeping chill of the concrete. Liam sat beside me, his long legs stretched out, his hands resting on his knees. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the wall opposite us, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing minute. This wasn't the comfortable silence of our evenings on the couch. This was a tense, charged silence, filled with all the things we weren't saying. The ritual of our physical closeness had been broken by this locked door, and without it, I felt exposed, vulnerable. There was no movie to distract us, no pretense of sleep to hide behind. It was just us, the cold, and the truth. "Why do you do it, Leo?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but clear in the enclosed space. It didn't sound accusatory. It sounded genuinely curious. I turned my head to look at him. His face was in shadow, but I could see the faint outline of his profile. "Do what?" I asked, though a cold dread was already coiling in my gut. I knew what he meant. "Let me," he clarified, still not looking at me. "All those nights, you let me just invade your space, take over your couch. You never say anything. You never push me away. Even when I can tell you're uncomfortable, or your leg is falling asleep, or you'd probably rather just go to your own bed. You just let me." He finally turned his head, and his eyes found mine in the dim light. Why? This was it. The question I had been dreading and, on some masochistic level, longing for him to ask for months. The moment where plausible deniability was no longer an option. My mind raced, searching for an easy answer, a platonic excuse that would satisfy him and keep my world from shattering. "Because you're my best friend. Because you were hurting. Because it's what friends do." All of them were true, but they were all incomplete. They were leaves scattered on the surface of a deep, dark well. The truth was at the bottom, heavy and immense. I could feel the walls I had so carefully constructed around my heart beginning to crack. For years, I had maintained them, patched the fissures, reinforced the foundations. But his grief had been like a rising tide, seeping through the cracks, eroding the mortar. His constant, innocent proximity had been like a persistent vine, its tendrils finding every weakness, widening every fault line. And now, this question, this simple, direct question, was the earthquake that threatened to bring the whole structure down. I opened my mouth to give him one of the easy answers, one of the safe lies. But the words wouldn't come. I looked at his face, at the genuine confusion and vulnerability there, and I realized that a lie would be the greatest betrayal of all. He wasn't just my secret love, he was my best friend. And he was asking for the truth. He deserved it. And maybe, after all these years of hiding, I deserved to finally speak it, whatever the consequences. The fear was immense, a physical thing that made my hands tremble and my stomach clench. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a sliver of desperate hope. I took a breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. I thought about the click of the lock, the finality of it. We were locked out. Maybe it was time to stop being locked in. Because, I started, my voice barely a whisper, a fragile, trembling thing. I had to stop and swallow, my throat suddenly tight. He waited, his gaze unwavering, patient. He gave me the space to find my words, just as I had always given him the space to find his silence. Because it's the only way I could have you close to me. The words hung in the cold, still air between us. They felt enormous, impossibly heavy. I had said it. After a decade of silence, I had finally said a piece of the truth. It wasn't the whole story, not the full, terrifying confession, but it was a door cracked open, letting a sliver of light into a room that had been dark for a very long time. Liam didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched me, his expression shifting from confusion to something I couldn't decipher. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter, more complex. It was as if I had handed him a puzzle box he had never seen before, and he was slowly, carefully turning it over in his hands, examining its strange and unfamiliar shape. The silence that followed my admission was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Every beat of my heart was a drum against my ribs. I had laid a single, vulnerable card on the table, and now I could do nothing but wait for him to play his hand. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. He was giving me an out, a chance to retreat, to rephrase it as something safe and platonic. He was trying to protect our friendship, even now. But I had already stepped off the ledge. There was no going back. "It means," I said, my own voice gaining a strange, shaky strength, "that I'm in love with you, Liam." I said his name. I had to. I had to make it clear that this wasn't some abstract confession. This was about him. The boy I met in the pool. The man who fell asleep in my lap. My best friend. I have been for years, I added, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. Probably since the beginning, if I'm being honest. Everything. Letting you stay over, the couch. All of it. For you, it was comfort. For me. I trailed off, unable to articulate the beautiful, painful complexity of what it had been for me. For me, it was everything. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that makes things weird, or if I've crossed a line. I never meant to. You asked why. And that's the truth. I finally ran out of words. The confession lay between us, a raw and living thing in the cold, sterile stairwell. I couldn't look at him anymore. I dropped my gaze to my own hands, which were clenched into tight fists in my lap. I had done it. I had taken a sledgehammer to the foundation. I waited for the crash, for the sound of our world coming down around us. I waited for him to stand up and walk away, to leave me there alone in the ruins. But he didn't move. The silence stretched again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't tense anymore. It was heavy with shock, with the weight of a decade of unspoken feelings finally brought into the light. I braced myself for the rejection, for the kind, pitying words of a straight best friend trying to let his gay friend down easy. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Oh," he said. Just that one, small word. It was not an exclamation of surprise or a question. It was a sound of dawning, of something clicking into place. It was the sound of a key, after a long struggle, finally turning in a lock. The aftermath of a confession is a strange and disorienting landscape. For years, my feelings for Liam had been a private, internal world, a secret garden I tended to in solitude. Now, the walls were down, the gate was open, and he was standing in the middle of it, looking around at the unfamiliar flora I had cultivated in his name. His single, quiet, "oh" was not the reaction I had prepared for. I had rehearsed scenarios of anger, of awkward pity, of gentle but firm rejection. I had no script for this soft, contemplative sound of realization. It left me untethered, floating in a sea of uncertainty. We didn't say anything else for what felt like an eternity. We just sat on the cold concrete steps, 2 feet apart, in a silence that was now thick with the enormity of what I had said. I risked a glance at him. He was no longer looking at me. He was staring down at his own hands, which were resting loosely between his knees. His brow was furrowed in concentration, as if he were trying to solve the most complex piece of code he had ever encountered. I had given him a new variable, one he had never accounted for, and it had thrown his entire equation into chaos. Eventually, the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter through the small, grimy window at the bottom of the stairwell. The city was beginning to wake up. We had spent the entire night in that concrete purgatory. My body ached from the cold and the uncomfortable posture, but it was a dull, distant pain compared to the sharp, vivid terror in my chest. I had just detonated a bomb in the center of my own life, and I was still waiting for the fallout. Around 6 in the morning, we heard the sound of a door opening and shuffling feet in the hallway. It was Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor, on her way to get the morning paper. Liam stood up first, his movements stiff. He opened the stairwell door and called out to her, his voice sounding rough from disuse. He explained our situation with a calm, practiced charm that felt jarringly normal. She, of course, had a spare key to the super's office, and within 15 minutes, we were standing in front of my apartment door again, this time with the right key in hand. The click of the lock turning felt anticlimactic. I pushed the door open, and the warm, familiar air of my apartment washed over us. It smelled like home. It smelled like coffee and old books and, faintly, of Liam. The sight of the living room, of the couch where our ritual had played out for months, was almost too much to bear. It looked like the scene of a crime. "I should go," Liam said, his voice flat. He was standing in the entryway, not quite in and not quite out, his hand on the doorknob. He wouldn't look at me. "Liam, wait," I said, my voice pleading. "We should talk about this." He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes made my heart plummet. The confusion was gone. In its place was a shuttered, guarded look I had never seen from him before. He had rebuilt his glass wall, and this time, it felt opaque, impenetrable. "I can't, Leo," he said, and his use of my name felt formal, distant. "Not right now. I need to go. I need to think," and with that, he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone in the apartment that was suddenly too big, too quiet. The silence he left behind was a roaring void. I sank onto the couch where he had slept against me just the night before, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry. I cried for my foolish, hopeful heart. I cried for the beautiful friendship I had just destroyed. I cried because for a single, terrifying moment in that stairwell, I had allowed myself to believe that his "oh" might mean something more. Now, I was sure it had just been the sound of an ending. The days that followed were the longest of my life. I existed in a fog of anxiety and regret. Every buzz of my phone made my heart leap into my throat, but it was never him. I sent him a single text the next day. "Are you okay?" Hours later, a reply came back. "Fine. Just busy with work." It was a polite, clinical dismissal. The Liam I knew would have sent a rambling, emoji-filled paragraph. This was a stranger. I tried to distract myself with work. I took on a new project, spent hours in my darkroom developing photos, the smell of chemicals a sharp, acrid comfort. But everything reminded me of him. A shot of a couple laughing on a park bench. The way the evening light fell across an empty chair. He was a ghost in every frame. My quiet, ordered world had been built around the central pillar of our friendship, and now that pillar was gone. The whole structure felt unstable, ready to collapse at any moment. I replayed the confession in my head 1,000 times. Had I been too blunt? Had I misread everything? I dissected every moment of the past few months, searching for clues I might have missed. His innocent need for comfort now seemed just that, innocent. I had projected my own feelings onto him, painting his grief in the colors of my own love. I had been so arrogant, so selfish, to think his physical closeness could mean anything more. He had come to me broken, and instead of just helping him heal, I had tried to make his healing about me. The shame was a physical weight, settling deep in my gut. After a week of agonizing silence, I couldn't take it anymore. The not knowing was worse than the rejection. I needed to hear it from him. I needed the final, painful closure. I needed him to tell me I had ruined everything so that I could finally begin the impossible task of moving on. I drove to his apartment one evening after work. I didn't call first. I knew if I did, he would just make an excuse. Standing outside his door, felt like a terrible echo of the night we were locked out of mine. This time, I was the one on the outside, hoping to be let in. I knocked, my knuckles rapping against the wood with a finality that terrified me. I heard movement inside, and then the door opened. He looked surprised to see me, and tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. He was wearing an old, faded t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair a mess. He didn't invite me in. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, that same guarded, shuttered look on his face. "Leo," he said. It wasn't a question. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "You can't just disappear, Liam. Our friendship, it deserves more than that. Even if I've ruined it. You owe me a conversation." He flinched at the word ruined. He scrubbed a hand over his face, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "It's not. You didn't ruin it," he mumbled, looking at the floor. "Then what is this?" I asked, my frustration finally boiling over. "This silence. You're treating me like a stranger. If you're disgusted or weirded out, just say it. Whatever it is, I can take it. But the silence. I can't take the silence." He finally looked up, and for the first time in a week, I saw a crack in his wall. I saw the friend I knew, and he looked miserable. "I'm not disgusted," he said, his voice raw. "God, Leo, no. Never that." He finally stepped back from the door, a silent invitation. Come in. His apartment was a mess. Dishes were piled in the sink. Clothes were draped over furniture. It was the physical manifestation of his mental state. We stood awkwardly in the middle of his living room, the space where I had sat with him the night Sarah left. "I've been a mess," he said, gesturing vaguely at the room. "I haven't been sleeping. I can't think straight because of what I said." I asked quietly. He shook his head, then nodded, then shook it again. "Yes. No. It's not that simple." He started pacing, a caged, restless energy I recognized all too well. "When you said what you said, it was like a bomb went off in my head. But not in a bad way. It was like it blew open a door to a room I didn't even know existed. And all this stuff came rushing out, and I didn't know what any of it was." He stopped pacing and faced me, his eyes wide with a kind of frantic confusion. "All these months, after Sarah left, I felt so lost. And the only place I felt safe, the only time my brain would shut up, was when I was at your place. With you. I told myself it was because you're my best friend. That's what it's supposed to be, right? But it was more than that. The quiet. The feeling of your breathing when I'd fall asleep on you. It was the only thing that felt real." He took a breath, running a hand through his already messy hair. "I just thought it was about comfort. About feeling less alone. But when you said you were in love with me, it didn't scare me. That's what's been messing me up all week. It should have scared me. It should have felt wrong. But it didn't. It felt like an answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking." My own breath caught in my chest. I didn't dare to hope. I just listened. "I started thinking back," he continued, his voice getting softer, more introspective. "About everything. About us. For years. Why I could never really give all of myself to Sarah or anyone else. Why I always felt like I was holding a part of myself back." She said I was living behind a glass wall. And she was right. But I think you were on the other side of it with me, and I never even realized it." He looked at me, his expression one of pure, heartbreaking vulnerability. "I've spent this entire week trying to make sense of it. Trying to fit my entire life, everything I thought I knew about myself, into this new shape. And I'm scared, Leo. I'm terrified. Because I don't know what this means. But I know I can't lose you. That's the one thing I figured out in all of this. The thought of not having you in my life it's unbearable." He had finally stopped talking. He stood there, completely open, completely raw, his confession a mirror image of my own. He had not given me an "I love you too." He had given me something far more precious. He had given me his honest, messy, beautiful confusion. He had shown me the chaos inside him, the terrifying and wonderful redrawing of his own map. I closed the distance between us in 2 steps. I didn't think. I just moved. I reached out and gently took his face in my hands. He flinched slightly at the contact, but he didn't pull away. He leaned into my touch, his eyes closing, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now," I whispered, my thumb stroking his temples. "We can just Be here. In the confusion. Together, he opened his eyes, and the green in them was so clear, so deep. He looked at me, really looked at me, in a way he never had before. The wall was gone. There was no glass between us anymore. Okay, he whispered. Together. And then, he was the one who leaned in. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss like in the movies. It was tentative. It was a question. His lips were soft, uncertain against mine. It was a kiss that tasted of fear and relief and the dizzying possibility of a new beginning. I responded gently, pouring a decade of unspoken love into the simple, quiet gesture. It wasn't an explosion. It was a sunrise. The slow, quiet, and inevitable arrival of light after a long, long night. We stood in the middle of his messy living room, and for the first time, nothing felt out of place. Everything, finally, was exactly where it was supposed to be. The days and weeks that followed our first kiss were a process of gentle discovery, like learning a new language. There were no grand declarations or dramatic shifts. Instead, our new reality revealed itself in 1,000 small, quiet moments. It was in the way he started holding my hand when we walked down the street, his fingers lacing through mine with a natural, unthinking ease. It was in the way our movie nights on the couch changed. The cuddling was no longer a ritual of unspoken need, but an explicit act of affection, punctuated by soft kisses and whispered conversations that lasted late into the night. We were mapping a new territory together, and we did it slowly, carefully, with a reverence for the fragile beauty of what we were building. Liam didn't move into my apartment, not right away, but he was there more often than he was at his own. He started leaving things behind, a toothbrush in the holder next to mine, a favorite sweatshirt draped over my desk chair, a bag of the specific coffee beans he liked in my kitchen cabinet. My space, which had for so long been just mine, a solitary sanctuary, slowly and beautifully began to accommodate him. Each new object was a quiet testament to his presence, a small anchor holding him there. The apartment began to feel less like my home and more like ours. One of the most significant changes was the bedroom door. For months, it had been a symbol of my silent, hopeful yearning, the open door he never walked through. Now, it was a symbol of our shared intimacy. The first night he stayed over after our conversation, after hours of talking and kissing on the couch, I stood up and held out my hand to him. "Come to bed," I said, the words feeling both momentous and perfectly simple. He took my hand without hesitation, and we walked into my bedroom together. That night, when I closed the door, the soft click of the latch wasn't a sound of exclusion, but one of inclusion. It was us, shutting out the rest of the world, creating our own private, safe space. Sleeping next to him was a revelation. After so many nights of being hyper-aware of his weight against me on the couch, of policing my own movements, the freedom of the bed was intoxicating. I could turn and face him, watch the peaceful expression on his face as he slept. I could reach out and trace the line of his shoulder, feel the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against my palm. In the middle of the night, he would often shift, an arm slinging over my waist, pulling me closer in his sleep. It was an unconscious, instinctual gesture of possession and comfort, and it filled the hollow spaces inside me that I didn't even know were still there. We were healing, both of us, in the quiet darkness of that room. He was healing from the confusion and loneliness that had plagued him for years, and I was healing from the long, solitary ache of a secret love. We talked. We talked more than we ever had before. He told me about the subtle, persistent feeling of disconnection he had felt in his past relationships, the sense that he was playing a part he didn't quite understand. He spoke of the ease he always felt with me, an ease he had mistaken for the simplicity of friendship, when in reality it was the profound simplicity of being truly seen and accepted. I, in turn, told him about the years of quiet observation, of the photographs I never showed anyone, the ones where he was the unwitting subject. I told him about the ache of watching him with his girlfriends and the quiet resignation I had learned to live with. There was no blame, no bitterness in our confessions. It was simply an honest accounting, a laying down of our respective burdens. With every story shared, The foundation of our new relationship grew stronger, built not on assumptions or pretenses, but on the solid ground of truth. Of course, it wasn't seamless. There were moments of fear and insecurity on both sides. I would sometimes catch myself falling back into old habits, analyzing his moods, searching for signs that he might be regretting his choice. And he had moments of quiet withdrawal, times when the sheer magnitude of the shift in his self-perception would overwhelm him. But the difference now was that we could talk about it. One evening, I found him staring out the window, a deep line of worry etched between his brows. I came up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my chin on his shoulder. "Where did you go?" I asked softly. He sighed, leaning back into me. "Just thinking. It's still so new, you know? Sometimes I feel like I'm an imposter in my own life. Like I'm going to wake up and none of this will be real." I tightened my grip. "I'm real," I said, pressing a kiss to the side of his neck. "This is real, and you're not an imposter. You're just you, the you that was there all along. You just finally opened the right door." He turned in my arms and looked at me, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. "God, I love you," he whispered, and the words, which had once been the most terrifying secret in my world, were now the safest and most beautiful sound I could imagine. They were not a confession of a new feeling, but a confirmation of an old and abiding truth that we were only now beginning to understand. We learned to create a life together in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. It was a silence no longer born of fear and unspoken things, but of a deep and abiding peace. It was the silence of a shared Sunday morning, reading in bed, our legs tangled together. It was the silence of working in the same room, me editing photos, him typing code, the quiet click of my mouse and the tap of his keys, a comforting, domestic soundtrack. It was the silence of knowing, without a single word, that we had finally, truly, come home. The locked door in the hallway had been an accident, a mundane inconvenience. But it had forced us out of the comfortable room of our friendship and into the cold, honest hallway of truth. It had stranded us until we had no choice but to face each other, and in doing so, we found not an ending, but the key to a door we never would have had the courage to open on our own.